of San Luis, City of San Luis Obispo just hired one. But the demographic I think that we're especially trying to reach would be people with families. And people do not necessarily subscribe to the Tribune hard copy. So, you know, there's a question about the effectiveness of educating the general public about the very specific, you know, question like, what do I do with this thing in my hand? And at the moment that they're going to do it, it's like, well, it's paper, but it had a pizza on top of it. So, you know, anyway, I think that education assumes that there's a level of ignorance in the student. And there's some information that they need to have, whereas marketing is a whole different thing. And it also is aimed toward changing behavior, which is what we're trying to do. I'm not sure if we're trying to educate people in terms of concepts or policies or data. I think really we're trying to train them to do the right thing. So I think that's something that we need to look into. Also, I believe that Cal Recycle does require education as part of the function of what we're doing. I know that for sure with 1383, that's a big part of it. I'm not sure, and maybe staff could look into it, but I do feel that education, we're saying education and outreach, you know, they're different things. There are different ways of approaching businesses, for instance. But if we look at who's actually generating the waste, you know, the generators of the waste, I'm thinking mostly organic, but in general, that would be a way of prioritizing and targeting specific businesses, you know. Yeah. I don't know about the whole issue of waste audits. I'm not sure how effective that could possibly be. But I would like to suggest that we also look into getting some younger people to help us with this a really attractive social media campaign. I think people get their information off their phones, off their cell phones, not necessarily from the movie theater or the Tribune. You know, we need to really think about that. So I'm encouraged to hear that there is coordination between the schools and the programs. But I do feel that we need to update our approach and certainly not ignore the children, but I do think we need to look at the question of what's most effective. Do we really expect the children to tell their parents what to do? Well, not every parent is happy to be told what to do by their kid, you know. I was open to it, but not every parent is, you know. So I think that's kind of a weak link there. So that's all I have to say right now. I think if we do decide to put a flyer in a newspaper, it should be the New Times. It's free. Everybody picks it up. It's all over the county. Okay, so I'll stop right there, but I do want to just affirm as part of our mission, education and outreach. So thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Robert?
Okay, my observation here is that we're nowhere near being ready to even write an RFP. It seems like there are too many questions, and the specific direction that we want to go is not clear. One of the things that I would suggest for the board would be, I think in the presentation here, the suggestions of going to the studio and seeing what Mike does. He says, watch a class program. I think that maybe he could bring us a program to the board and present it himself. And the other is maybe he could, and I know when I went to the studio, he showed me a little test that they give with, you know, a product, and then you had to pick which bin to put it in, which clearly I couldn't do. Is what did Jan say, that you're teaching to the ignorant people? So I confess. But right now I'd like to say thank you to Mike for being here today. His response and reply to a lot of our questions was very helpful. And I think it brings up the fact that he does a lot more than what we're really aware of. And at the summary of his report, I think he wrote down, there's some bullet points there. I think they're worth looking at. There's about 14 of them, things that they do that really we're not aware of. So I think we need to do a lot more homework before we start thinking about writing a RFP. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. And I would agree in the sense that, I mean, I'm not sure I think we need to have a discussion at the board level at some point. And then we do expect staff then to, you know, work on an RFP based on guidance received from the full board. It's not a, you know, must do real soon thing, but you know, it's something we have been talking about, I think, since September, when we, as a board, agreed that we would do an RFP at some point. So I'm thinking that it's not on our full board agenda for next week, other than it's listed as a future agenda item, so that maybe in April or at some point we have a full, you know, get feedback from the full board, and then, you know, provide staff direction that they can proceed on. And Jan, I made my comment based in terms of it not being an actual requirement, except that it is in our integrated waste management plan, which then, you know, Cal Recycle expects us to do it. That was from talking with Rob Hilton at HF&H about, you know, what is the requirement for a education and outreach program, and his comment to me was that it's not legally required under any of this legislation, but you are required to have an integrated waste management plan. And if you put it in your plan that you're going to have an education and outreach program, then Cal Recycle expects you to have an education and outreach program. So, you know, logically, we have to have one of some sort. And I think it's evident. It's just like all things in marketing, though. It's very difficult to know how effective. You know, they say, they openly admit in marketing that half of your marketing dollars are wasted. You just don't know which half. You know, and because it's very hard to evaluate the effectiveness of certain things.
So, President Barbeau, the SB 1383 does require an education component, but that's only on organics.
On the organic piece.
Just on the organic piece. So it doesn't encompass the legislative requirement isn't on the broader scope that your board is discussing today.
All right, thank you, Jeff. Okay, with that, I think we're ready to move on to, unless Pablo, you had any questions about what we just said as far as the future.
Not really any questions. You know, I took a lot of notes from today's discussion so that we'd be prepared to come back to the next executive committee meeting, work through some of those issues so that we're really prepared for the board as a whole. And I guess the only other thing that for next Wednesday, there was a little bit of discussion today about potentially having an ad hoc committee for the educational component. And my understanding is that if during future agenda items at the regular board meeting, that if the board wanted to have an ad hoc committee, that could be done really at any time.
Right. Okay, well then we will move on to our next agenda item, which is discussion of the draft March full board meeting agenda. So Pablo, do you want to present that?
Yeah, we'll go through. I do have two items that I think we are going to want to consider changing on this. The first is on the consent agenda. So if we can jump forward, thanks, Sasha. Number 9, our screen is very fuzzy. I'm not sure if there's a way to improve that, but number 9 reads approval of the SB 1383 program coordinator job description. Oh, very good, much clearer now. And so we're going to remove that. Kelly and I went through the existing job description, and we find that it works well. We put this on initially simply because of the timing of publishing the executive committee agenda and coming up with a draft for the regular board. And subsequent to posting and everything, Kelly and I have gone through it. So we do not think that we need to take anything to the board on the program coordinator jobs description. And the remainder of the consent agenda items are pretty routine and reoccurring.
I do have a question. If, we have on here re-ratifying the resolution to allow us to continue to meet virtually because of the state of emergency. Do we have any idea of when, the state's moving forward with eliminating mask mandates indoors and things like that, but we're still, I assume, under a state of emergency. Do we have any idea when that might change, and if that, and whenever that does change, whether it's 2 months from now or 9 months from now, will that, as we understand it now, impact our ability to hold meetings remotely?
Yes, our understanding right now is that at the end of March, the emergency will be over. And so staff is currently working with the staff of the city of San Luis Obispo in order to have live meetings at the city council chambers. The scheduled time for executive committee meetings, the city council's chambers are not available for the executive committee meetings. And we were thinking we'd probably have them here at the IWMA conference room. And certainly even the number of members of the public who were participating today, there'd be sufficient room for them to participate. So again, we're anticipating that we'll go live back in April. We also have the general understanding that on site, and this is really, I believe, based on pre-existing law, we need to have a quorum on site, but anybody who wanted to participate remotely, then their remote location would need to be able to have access for the public and public comment from the remote location as well. So we'd be going back to the old rules. And that right now we're anticipating for the April board meeting.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm glad I brought it up then, because I didn't realize that. I thought they would extend the state of emergency out longer than that. If that's the case, that we could potentially be looking at in-person meetings as soon as April. I think under future agenda items on the board meeting, you probably should add you might want to provide that same information you just did to us.
Yes.
So that the full board knows that it may not be that far off in the future when we go back to physical meetings. And I was very interested in the comment you made about, because my question was going to be, well, can an agency have a Zoom or a hybrid meeting? And it sounds like you're saying that you'd have to have an in-person meeting with a quorum, but you could allow, members,
Yes.
individual members, less than a quorum to participate remotely.
Yes.
And that's,
Yes.
Is a substantial change, because I think over these last 2 years, a lot of board members have gotten used to the idea of not having to drive into SLO to attend an IWMA meeting, and some of them might want to exercise that option if we can allow them to do so. Okay, well, I'm glad I asked that question then. Okay. I'm sorry, I interrupted. That was the consent calendar.
So the addition on the consent, and then on the regular agenda, we're going to go through them one by one, but before doing so, I'm anticipating that the regular agenda is also supposed to have an item for, although that's in closed session on the executive director recruitment, and the open has to be the salary, establishing salary.
Yes, but I would anticipate you and I coordinate on putting both of those on the regular agenda.
Yes, and so they're not on the regular agenda right now. And in order to move, the board's efforts with the recruitment forward, legal counsel and I are going to coordinate, and you should anticipate that something along those lines would be on the regular agenda.
For March 9th or,
Yes.
okay,
We anticipate having Mr. Avery's brochure profile, candidate
Okay.
profile information, as well as salary consideration for the board, which would be an open session item. And then there would be a corollary closed session item on the recruitment effort.
okay, did you hear that, Ken and Robert? So that item's not listed, but you'll anticipate adding that before we publish this full board agenda.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, and the point being is that in order to do the recruitment and to have the salary there, then that has to be approved by the board in an open session of a regular board meeting.
Gotcha. Okay, so that will be added to the March 9th meeting before it is published out to the public.
Yes.
Okay, got it. So please proceed.
So next slide, just walking through them on the AB 1276 discussion. We'll have the actual statute there. The primary provision there is that on or before June 1, 2022, a city county shall authorize an enforcement agency to enforce this chapter. So 1276 has enforcement provisions. And I think that, based on prior board discussion, IWMA was not going to be delving into enforcement. And so we'll have it on the agenda in case there's any discussions there. But it's really then the responsibilities of the cities to undertake enforcement actions associated with AB 1276.
But there are many things that, the enforcement falls to the jurisdictions, but the IWMA is still the body that, informs businesses of the requirements and that sort of thing. So IWMA would still be the one telling businesses about the requirements of AB 1276, correct?
Well, that would be the direction we'd want to get.
Okay, so that'll be part of our discussion next week is what role do we want the IWMA to play in 1276?
Yes.
Okay.
I should note that I think we're going to have it's going to be a significant agenda that we wanted to make sure to bring this item forward pretty quick because June 1st is just around the corner. But the next two items are going to, really be some pretty significant items. So next slide, please.
Well, are you, would there be, based on the fact that the next two items are going to take a lot of time and they're very important items, should the 1276 discussion be pushed off a month, or it needs to be done in March in order to have sufficient time to work with the cities on anything that comes out of it?
I am concerned about timing, especially because we're going to be adding the open session item regarding the executive.
Okay.
So perhaps the alternative approach then is to push the board discussion on 1276 to the April meeting. And then we at staff level can follow up through like the local task force meeting and everything else to make sure that the staff of all of the participating agencies are up to speed on 1276.
I think that would be a good approach. Is that okay with Jan and Robert that we push that staff, coordinate with jurisdictions on 1276 and bring that discussion to the board, defer it until April?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And, it's basically affecting the restaurants is my understanding. So, the question would be also if there's some kind of strategy in terms of informing the restaurants about the requirements there, so I think it makes sense to postpone it in terms of our agenda.
Yeah, and I thought that was already happening, that information was being provided to restaurants. Maybe I'm wrong about that.
Well, I don't know the details, but I do know that some of the restaurants are getting the information because they've already started responding.
Right. I mean, I thought that even just as part of our, like 1383 outreach that, when you're talking to a restaurant, you say, oh, by the way, there's also this 1276 thing we've got to comply with and be aware of. So, okay, but as far as bringing it back to the full board for discussion, we'll push it till April, and you guys will work with the jurisdictions to make sure they're informed and in tune with 1276. Okay. So then we have the biggies.
So approval of the draft amendment to the JPA, and legal counsel has routed the draft that came out of the ad hoc committee to all of the agencies and has requested comments back by March 2nd so that any revisions can be done and posted to the board's agenda. In general, some of the feedback that I'm getting is a discussion between what's the difference between mandates only and minimum measures to comply with, the requirements of the mandates. And that will probably be an interesting discussion with the board because it overlaps between JPA issues and policy issues. The JPA clearly based on direction is, a mandates only moving forward. We keep in the JPA umbrella, IWMA umbrella, previously adopted ordinances. But mandates is different than the issue of what actions, what strategies are taken in order to address those mandates. So again, anticipate some discussion with the board about mandates versus the policy direction on how to address those mandates. And then the second one I'm getting a little bit of feedback is on the composition of the board itself and special districts and whether 2 or 1 special districts would be appropriate. But those are just the general nature of some of the comments that I've heard. And again, that will be, part of the board's discussions really, because that's the direction. Staff will carry out the direction as the board decides.
I have one comment.
And are you getting any comments back yet, Jeff? The comments are coming back to you.
Right.
Copy
I'm trying to
Pablo.
get close to this microphone. So I have received no comments yet from member agencies or participating agencies. However, I do want the executive committee to know that Cal Recycle has reviewed and responded to the draft JPA that is being presented. They had 2 very minimal comments. So we know that Cal Recycle is not going to object to the current structure as proposed, as the IWMA continuing as a regional agency with the structure that includes all the special districts as participating agencies and how we've proposed it. So I know that was an issue that was a pending question until this meeting, certainly.
Thank you. Okay. Anything else on that item? Okay. Any questions, Jan or Robert, on that item and in terms of how it'll be presented at the full board meeting?
I have no questions at this time.
Robert, you have your hand raised?
I'll be brief. I didn't read in here. I read the thing about state mandates only, but I didn't, if it's in there, I did not see the part that said something about keeping the previously adopted
It's in there.
ordinances. The other comment I had was we're using the county as our auditor controller. And I think that discussion came up in some of the issues with the county leaving. And in fact, they were the auditor controller that they were griping about how things went wrong at the IWMA. And I've noticed that we put in here that we could change that. And I think that that's something we should make clear that, I don't know, I think we should have a discussion about it. And the other one, Jeff, if you're here, this issue of the open and competitive process for hiring our director, I think we're too far down the line make that change and have any effective difference now. Maybe you could chime in on that.
Thank you. I think the question that I raised was, does the board want, it's fine to have a policy that the board would go for open and competitive process every time it seeks an executive director. My question to the board as a whole and to this committee is, do you want to be tied to that in a joint powers agreement, or should that just simply be a matter of policy? Because certainly these things can change from time to time, where the board may want the flexibility to identify and choose someone without going through a competitive process. I've seen agencies select general managers or executive directors in all sorts of scenarios. So I was only bringing that up as a question.
Okay, I would simply respond to that by saying I think that this a little bit overdoes that, ties our hands a little bit in the way it's written right now.
Jan?
If I might respond to his.
Well, go ahead. Well,
And,
Jan, Pablo's got a comment.
And then Director Ans, regarding the county auditor controller, I did follow up with a conversation with Jim Hamilton. And we discussed the statutory provisions in the government code regarding JPAs and special districts, especially having the ability to utilize the services as a county auditor. And he certainly was agreeable to the extent that he provides services to special districts and others. And, you know, so the form of how we would do so is something that we need to follow up with him on. Whether that's just an agreement with his office, since he is a duly elected official and has certain statutory powers. I always sort of draw the analogy to the county sheriff, where the county sheriff has, you know, lots of statutory powers that he doesn't go to the Board of Supervisors for permission to execute. So the auditor controller was certainly open in the idea as acting as our paying agent, wants to avoid the perception that he is doing more than, you know, those basic services to all the special districts and JPAs, and, you know, really avoid perceptions that had developed in the past. So he's agreeable, and then myself and legal counsel need to follow up on the form of how that would occur. And as you noted, the JPA itself gives the board the ability to modify those appointments.
Can you make one? Sorry. Director Ans, in response to your initial question, Section 7 of the draft amendment that you have there does provide that all existing IWMA ordinances, rules, and regulations, whether mandated or not, will remain in full force and effect. So that's the last sentence of Section 7, titled Express Limitation of Powers.
Okay, thank you, Jeff.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Jan?
Yes, I just was going to ask Mr. Minnery to point out that section, because I did recall that it was in there. So he already did it without my asking. So thank you, Mr. Minnery. Okay, that's all I have.
And my only comment is based on the questions there. I mean, I like, you know, that the JPA, because this is a very long-term document, gives us the flexibility of either sticking with or using someone else as the treasurer. We'd like to stick with the county auditor controller as long as he's willing to do that. And as you indicated, he wants it to be clear that he's only our paying agent and not our auditor and inspector. But so it's good, it's smart to have flexible language in there. And along those lines, I would agree that not tying the board's hands regarding the selection of an executive director, you know, that should be a personnel policy, not something in the founding document. At least I believe that. I would comment that given what, you know, this agency's been through in the last 3 years, that might, you know, raise a few eyebrows to eliminate that out of the JPA. I personally think it's not something that should be in the JPA, but I could see that it might raise a few eyebrows, eliminate it. Okay, so that's that item. That's going to be a big item of discussion. Maybe it won't take that much time, but it's a very important item of discussion, I would say. So proceed to the next step.
Next slide. And so then this is the item on the fees itself. And a couple of quick clarifications, because I've had some phone calls since the last board meeting, is the 5.4% fee on gross hauler receipt is to be calculated the same way that it is currently being calculated. And so that drives on how the different franchise agreements are calculated. That came up both sort of in a question that indirectly in a question from Director Hammonds regarding should it really be based on net gross receipts, and but in any case, we've been using the term gross hauler receipts in the generic sense, but the actual details of calculating the 5.4% and references back to the franchise agreements on how franchise fees are calculated. That's still in the proposed fee resolution. It was in the fee resolution that was adopted in June, and it's the historical method of calculating. So I think that might actually help address some of those questions. My thoughts itself with regarding this presentation is that there are a lot of different variables that still exist, and I get the sense that there might be a few board members who are still somewhat uncomfortable, and that's understandable. So I have an approach to presenting the recommendation as it is right now, but I also want to focus in on what is the board direction that might help ensure that what we're doing moving forward is going to meet the pleasures of the board. So for example, knowing that developing the fee setting policy and establishing rate monitoring and those efforts in the fee setting policy, provides that general type of direction of monitoring the fees, looking on a quarterly basis, coming back to the board. But also I think it will be helpful for some specific direction. We already know, some of that's been established by the board. For example, doing an RFP on the educational services, because that will be helpful for accountability, cost effectiveness, and really, making sure we're doing the best that we can do there. Also had board direction through the recent HF&H contract on, at the appropriate time and when directed by the board, to do fee calculations based on customer accounts. The last board discussion was to look at potentially different methods of, again, rather than gross hauler receipts, or what I've just characterized as a modified gross hauler receipts. Really, that definition has got details in it. But is there an approach that goes based on net hauler receipts? So we have some specific board direction coming out, but whether or not other board direction would be appropriate. One of the ideas that I've heard in some of the feedback that I've gotten is board approves the fees, then by June 30th of 2023, the board will need to reauthorize the fees. And the theory on the feedback that I got from that is, well, it's good to give staff direction on a bunch of to-dos coming out of a big hearing, but how does the board have assurance that that stuff's really going to come back to the board so that the board can have serious deliberations on it? And so I got some feedback that, well, why not have it reauthorized? Not reapproved, but reauthorized. So that's a little bit, because if there's a firm deadline by June 30th of 2023 that it has to come back to the board, and that certainly prompts that higher level of diligence. I tend to believe we'll be back anyhow, but again, that's some of the feedback that I've gotten.
Well, I was going to say that to me, the board approves a budget annually. To me, to reauthorize a fee that has changed once in 20 years, to turn around, we've had a set fee for 20 years. We haven't revisited as a result of 1383. It doesn't make sense to me to revisit a fee level every year, other than through the budgetary process, which is when we're approving the expenditures and in essence then reapproving all the programs that the agency does. And if we get to a point, and hopefully we would get to a point where we'd say, hey, you know what, we don't need 5.4%. To support this budget, support these programs, we propose to lower the rate to 5% or whatever. Because as we all know, you can lower a rate easier than you can raise a rate. But my point is, I don't see putting on, but that's a discussion we can have in the full board meeting. If a lot of people want that, well, maybe we have to look at it. Before I proceed, we are as far as the executive committee meeting, we are in the middle of the agenda item regarding review of the full board meeting agenda. And I want to make sure I don't forget that we do allow public comment on that agenda item. So we're kind of going through each agenda item that will be on the full board agenda. I want to just go out to the public and give the public the opportunity at this point, see if we have any public comment on any of the items shown to be on the full board agenda for March 9th.
At this time, if a member of the public wishes to make a comment on the full board agenda, you may press the raise hand button found at the bottom of your screen, or if you're on the phone, you may press *9. I have no raised hands.
All right, thank you. Okay, proceed, public, please.
I think that's pretty much it. I'm looking at the time, 12:40. We still have a closed session. I say that Janine just raised her hand a tad bit late, but bottom.
Okay. Oh, there it says. Okay. Yeah, tell me, since we just cut that off, Janine, did you have a specific comment regarding the full board agenda for March 9th?
I just wanted to make a comment back on public education for the green waste and the blue bins. In my neighborhood, we have 3 streets of about 80 homes. There's about 10 homes with children. The rest are single adults, grandparents.
We already
Those
covered.
people are not getting any education to
Okay. All right,
how to fill the bins. And
all right. Okay, we already covered, that education item in terms of the review from Science Discovery and had public comment on that. So we're going to have to preclude further public comment on that. So, okay. So we're ready to move into the closed session then? Or was I'm sorry, Robert or Jan, did you have any questions regarding item 12 on the full board agenda, the rating?
No questions.
Jan? Good. Okay.
Oh, wait, Jan, you're muted.
All right, I unmuted. Oh God, sorry. This is my phone going crazy on me. Yeah, it would be helpful with this item if staff could crack out kind of a decision tree and surface the issues and in some way structure. Oh, I'm not talking. I'm sorry. I was talking about item 12, not closed session. I just think that would be helpful in terms of facilitating a productive conversation to just, crack out the issues, try to put together a sort of a rational structure of how we're going to talk about all that. So that's my comment. Thanks. Sorry for my cell phone going off.
Thank you, Jan. Okay, I think now we are ready to proceed to next item, which is the closed session discussion. And so,
I'm sorry, do we have a motion for the agenda?
oh, I'm sorry, good point. We need a motion for the approval of the agenda. for the
So
full
moved.
board.
Second.
Okay.
Okay.
And that's as discussed with any adjustments as discussed. Okay. Okay. Roll call, please.
Ms. Marks,
Yes.
Mr. Enns,
Yes.
and Mr. Bourbeau.
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously.
Thank you. And thank you for reminding us that we needed that. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, so we are ready to proceed into closed session. And are we going out into a break room or are we
Public
just?
comment on closed session.
Yeah, we'll have public comment. Yeah, we're going to see if we have any public comments regarding the closed session item.
At this time, if a member of the public has a comment on the closed session item, you may press the raise hand button found at the bottom of your screen. Or if you're on the phone, you may press *9. I have nobody for public comment.
Thank you. Then we're ready to proceed into closed session. And are we going to do that by just having the rest of staff remove themselves from participation and shutting the meeting? Or are we going out into a breakout room?
We're going to close the meeting. I don't have breakout room in webinar, so
How do we get
So
back
we
to the
will report
close?
Robert, you can just stay where you're at and everybody else will just need to leave the room.
Okay, thank you.
We'll just see the rest of the staff disappear. And then it'll just be conference room and Dan and Robert.
And we can report out a closed session at the next
Next
executive
meeting.
committee meeting.
So we'll report out if there's any reportable action at the March full board meeting, March 9th. Okay, so we just waiting then for Barbara and Sasha to depart, and it'll say stop recording. And then we will be ready to discuss.
And Barbara, it will say stop recording.
Yes, I got all the attendees out and I locked the meeting.